Hi, I'm Brother Jake. Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, what's this Book of Mormon thing? Well, the Book of Mormon is another testament of Jesus Christ, just like the Bible, and it's full of uplifting stories that will bring you peace and happiness. Let me summarize it for you. It all starts with this prophet named Lehi who was living in Jerusalem in like 600 BC. So he had this dream where God told him that Jerusalem was going to get the kibosh, and he and his family had to escape to a promised land. Now, he had these four sons named Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. Sam was pretty cool, and Nephi was pretty much the strongest, most righteous dude ever. But Laman and Lemuel were these whining little jerks that always complained about everything and were constantly trying to kill Nephi. So Lehi and his family went out into the wilderness with these brass plates that were like a book with all the commandments written on them, which, by the way, Nephi had gotten by finding the guy who owned them passed out drunk and God telling Nephi to kill that guy because it was better for that guy to get his head cut off than for Lehi's whole crew to be spiritually screwed by having no scriptures with them. Anyway, while they were in the wilderness, Nephi had this dream where he saw the promised land that his family was going to later get discovered by a Gentile who sailed across the ocean blue, and then colonized by people fleeing religious persecution, and then the colonies break away from the motherland, set up a land of liberty. So you can probably guess where the promised land was. Anyway, so they build a boat and sail from the Middle East all the way to America. Then Lehi dies, and Laman and Lemuel split off with their own people and set up their own civilization. So there's two groups of people, the Nephites, who are all the good people, and the Lamanites, who are all the bad people. And since the Lamanites were so lazy and bloodthirsty, God put a curse on them so their skin turned dark, and the Nephites would know not to intermarry with them. Anyway, eventually Nephi dies, and Jacob, his righteous younger brother, who was born while they were in the wilderness, becomes the prophet. But he kind of had a rough time with it because the Nephites were always going off the rails, and he was constantly having to tell them how they should be nice to each other and only have one wife, unless God says it's okay to have more. So anyway, like 300 years later, the Nephites have this king named Benjamin, and right at the end of his life, he builds this tower and makes this awesome speech about how Jesus is going to come and how they all needed to recognize how tiny and insignificant before God they were, and they should just get off their behinds and repent, and they totally did. So then King Benjamin dies, and his son Mosiah becomes the new king. So Mosiah was thinking, hey, whatever happened to those people in that land of Lehi Nephi place? Oh, shoot, I almost forgot. Okay, back up a second. So when Mosiah was king, but not this Mosiah, I mean his grandpa, King Benjamin's dad, who was also named Mosiah, the Nephites had to escape from the Lamanites, and while they were running off to a new place, the Nephites discovered this whole other city that was filled with these other people that spoke another language. And after they all got on the same page language-wise, they found out that these other people were descendants of Mulek, who was the only surviving son of Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah before the Israelites were conquered by the Babylonians. And the Mulekites escaped when the Israelites were taken captive and also built a boat and also sailed from the Middle East all the way to America to live. Oh, and it turns out the Mulekites had discovered some other people called the Jaredites, who lived way before the Nephites or Mulekites and sailed from the Middle East to America right after the whole Tower of Babel fiasco in these almond-shaped, totally sealed submarines that were propelled by the wind even though they had no sail, using special rocks that shone all the time because they had been touched by the finger of Jesus as a light source. Anyway, after they got here, the Jaredites created a huge civilization that eventually imploded in a civil war where millions died in the final battle until there was only like one guy left who was discovered by the Mulekites way later. Anyway, eventually the Mulekites decided to join up with the Nephites in this place called Zarahemla, but then some of the Nephites were like, we can't just let the Lamanites take over the motherland, and some of them went back to the land of Lehi Nephi where the Nephites ran away from with the first Mosiah. So then later the other Mosiah sent some dudes to check if those guys were okay. Well, it turns out they weren't doing so great since they had become enslaved by the lazy, idolatrous Lamanites, but the Nephites Mosiah had sent helped the Mulekites escape by getting all the Lamanite guards wasted on extra strong wine and sneaking the population of an entire city out the front gate while the Lamanites were passed out. See how bad drinking booze is? Anyway, then they all went back to Mosiah and the whole monarchy was disbanded for a system of democratically elected judges. So later on, this prophet named Alma teamed up with this other guy named Amulek, and they became like this missionary dream team. Like one time they got thrown in prison and all the people that believed what they taught got burned in a bonfire, even though Alma and Amulek could have saved them, but they didn't because God wanted to make sure the people that were burning them would go to hell for doing it. Oh, and then there was this other guy named Ammon who went to go preach to the Lamanites, and they took him prisoner, but he told them that he just wanted to like help him out, so he became one of the king's servants. Anyway, eventually he protected the king's flock of sheep by chopping off the arms of all the people that were trying to steal it and taking the severed arms back to the king. And the Lamanite king was so impressed with Ammon's dismembering skills that he asked Ammon to share his message of peace and love, and later his entire kingdom converted to Christianity and became friends with the Nephites and called themselves the anti-Nephi Lehites, which might sound confusing but basically means good guys. But then this bad guy named Amalickiah decides that the whole democracy thing really isn't for him and that he should be king, but before he can become king, this military leader named Captain Moroni, who's pretty much a mix between Chuck Norris and Moses, rips off his shirt and writes basically a pre-Columbian American version of the Declaration of Independence on it. So the bad guy runs off to the Lamanites and becomes the king there and starts a huge war, but with the help of these 2,000 anti-Nephi Lehi teenagers that had so much faith that they couldn't be killed, the Nephites eventually win and get things back on track. Well, kind of, because like almost immediately after the war, the Nephites and Lamanites get attacked by this group called the Gadiaton Robbers, who are basically like the Incan Mafia. So the good Lamanites and the Nephites band together against the thugs, at which point the good Lamanites turn back white again and beat those guys down. Then bam, all these crazy natural disasters hit and cover the land in darkness for 3 days, during which the voice of Christ speaks to all the survivors and explains that all those disasters were signs of his death and that all the cities that were completely annihilated, along with all the people in them by floods and fires and earthquakes and landslides, got wiped out because every single one of the people in them were bad and deserved to die, and all the people that were alive survived because they were more righteous than the people who had died. Then, after a little while, Jesus visits the Nephites and gives them an almost word-for-word version of the biblical Sermon on the Mount and teaches people how to get baptized and blesses the little kids and calls 12 apostles just like he did in the Bible. And after he dropped all the knowledge and love and blessings they could handle on them, he went back into heaven. So after Jesus left, the Nephites lived in a socialist utopia for like 200 years. But then they started getting greedy and not following the true church, and the Gadian robbers made like a serious comeback, and then the Lamanites and the Nephites got back to a total war to the death, which kind of continued this whole cycle of the Nephites being good and then getting really rich because they're so good, and then getting kind of cocky because they're so rich, and then becoming bad because they're so cocky, and then getting thrashed by the Lamanites because they're so bad, and then becoming good again because they got thrashed. Anyway, eventually it all kind of falls apart, and the Nephites get wiped out by the Lamanites, who became what we know as Native Americans, and Mormon, who is this military leader of the Nephites and a prophet, threw together like a Cliff Notes version of his people's history on these gold plates and gave the plates to his son Moroni, who decided to throw the Jaredite story in there and write how if we prayed to ask if the Book of Mormon was true and believed hard enough while we were asking, God would make us feel like it was. Then he buried the gold plates in a stone box in a hill that was like literally right behind where Joseph Smith would live like 1500 years later. Coincidence? I don't think so. So that's the Book of Mormon. See? Good, clean family fun.